Hi, my name is Justin Kello. I am the Media Arts Pastor for the City Rise Network, and I'm excited to be with you today to wrap up our study of Joseph. And so we're finishing that this week, launching into our Christmas series next week, and we've really enjoyed the past 5 weeks of digging into this guy's life and applying it to our lives today. What I love about Joseph is that this story happened thousands of years ago, but there's no shortage of application points for our modern lives. And so I'm so excited to wrap it up with you today. Real quick, one note, if you are watching in our app, I love it. I'm so glad. You can actually click over and find the fill-in notes for today. If you're watching in some other venue, Facebook or YouTube, download the app, cityrise.org/app, and you can have the fill-in notes for today. You can actually email those to yourself after the sermon's over, so you can look at those later and maybe add those to your study, or go back if you want to kind of dig deeper into what we're talking about today. But I would invite you to do that. So yes, this is the last week of Joseph. It's truly been a roller coaster. I mean, this guy, he starts out as this arrogant little brother bragging about these like big dreams of how awesome he's going to be and how his brothers are going to bow down to him. And then he's kind of sold into slavery. He's elevated to a place of power, and then he like crashes down into prison after a bad situation. And then he's elevated again to even more power. He saves a nation from starvation. He reconciles with his brothers. I mean, this is literally a soap opera in real life. Like, we believe the Bible is true in every sense of the word. And so this guy had a crazy life, a true roller coaster. And we're tying the bow on this series today, the end of this part of Joseph's story in Genesis. And the thing is, to tie a bow on it, it gets ridiculously theological. Like, it gets deep. The final message of Joseph's life, kind of the big, when you come back around to the end of it, the message we have is really a deep theological concept that we're going to dig into today. The brief we get, so we have a company that helps us kind of find the most relevant things to look at in each story when we dig into the Bible together. And the brief that was given to me looked like a seminary dissertation. I mean, it had words like incompatibilism and libertarianism and hard determinism, just like words that I can't begin to describe what they mean, because my master's degree is in youth ministry. Okay, we learned, the proper way to make a dodgeball playoff bracket. Like, that's kind of what we spent our time figuring out, or how much pizza to order for a lock-in. Like, we didn't go deep into like hard determinalism, but fortunately, they prepared me well by giving me this content to dig through with you. And I'm going to dumb it down for you because I need it dumbed down for me. So if you're looking for like the dissertation, seminary style presentation of this, you might need to find somebody else. Like, I'm dumbing it down for me, and if you're like me, I hope that you can understand what's going on. So, we're going to read Genesis chapter 50. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but we are going to be in Genesis chapter 50 today, and I'm reading from the ESV. Here's what it says. It says, "Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father." So dad just died. Jacob just died. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return." And Pharaoh answered, "Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear." So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And then there's a bunch of words I can't pronounce, so I'm skipping those. They end up burying Jacob where he wants to be buried, and they do all the things that they should do, and then they go back to Egypt. And in verse 15, it says this. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And then beyond that, it says Joseph lived to a total of 110 years, and then he died and was buried and all those things. So, review. Okay, so we got a big funeral for Jacob, for Joseph's dad, the dad of all the tribes of Israel, including people from Egypt. So, it may not be quite as big as like the Queen's funeral that happened several months ago, but it's kind of that same idea. Like a lot of people gathered together. They went on this procession to take this body. It lasted many, many days, many weeks. The brothers doubt their earlier reconciliation with Joseph. So we talked about how they fixed their problems. Like Joseph said, hey, we're good. I'm going to help you. And they end up working together to solve the famine. But they think maybe this reconciliation was only as good as long as Dad was alive. Maybe now that Dad's gone, we're in trouble again. And so they reach out to him. They write out a letter, asserting that Dad wanted everyone to get along. And Joseph was like, of course, who am I to be mad at you? Like, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Like, we're all good with this. Don't worry about it. And so there's several things we can learn from this passage, but the first thing I want to talk about is that the honor you earn extends to those you love most. So the first thing that sticks out to me in this chapter is that we have this funeral for Jacob who didn't do anything for Egypt, but all of Egypt was sad about it. Like, the hero of the story is Joseph. He's the one that, had the food during the famine. He's the one that took care of Pharaoh's household in the country. Jacob was just the dad, but he was honored in such a way that was kind of just unparalleled. Like, he had a really, really big ceremony. The Egyptians were weeping. He sent all of his servants, like the elders of Egypt, were going with him to bury this guy. Joseph was the one who did all the good for the nation, though. Joseph was the one who solved the famine issue. Joseph was the one who ran the country. Jacob was just the dad. And so what I want you to understand is that the good you do directly impacts the world's perception of those you love most. Okay? So the good that you do directly impacts how people view the people you love most in your life. Doing good brings honor to my wife. Doing good brings honor to my kids. Doing good brings honor to my parents, to my employer. And doing good brings honor to my God. Like, when we do good, we are bringing honor to the people we love most. And so if you find yourself lacking the motivation to do good, if you find yourself kind of like, man, why even bother with doing the right thing? Or why even bother with showing up in this way? Or why even bother with giving my best to this situation or to whatever's going on? You're bringing honor to the people you love most based on what you do or don't do. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture for me today, is that if you live a life like Joseph, his dad ended up being honored simply because Joseph was a great guy and he did all these great things for this country. So if you find yourself questioning, how can I continue to do good? Where's my motivation? One of the motivations can be, it's how your family is perceived, but it's also how God is perceived based on what you do. Remind yourself that the good you do or do not do directly impacts how others perceive God. Now, there are many people leaving the church, and now I think over thousands of years, like, the population of Christianity goes up and down. So I'm not this like doomsayer that like the church is dying, but there are people who are leaving the church based almost entirely on how they see Christians behaving. And now these may be nominal believers, or they weren't really Christians, or what, you can define all you want, but they're pointing to situations where Christians are behaving in a way that makes them think less of our God. That's what's impacting these people. Church scandals, hateful rhetoric, judgmental attitudes. And many assert that these people are leaving simply because our beliefs about sin are too much for them to handle. And that may be part of it. I understand that that's part of it. Our preaching about and teaching what God believes about marriage and about family and about, morals, a lot of those things are offensive to people. They don't like to hear it. But I think even further, there are people who are leaving the church because Christians don't behave like Jesus very well. Okay, and they're not representing him well. The things they're doing or not doing are not bringing honor to God. Because the things I'm observing online, when I see people sharing, why they left the church or what's going on, they can usually point to an attitude or a belief or a specific situation where someone who follows God hurt them or somebody else. And now it's easy for us to say, it's like, well, we're imperfect people and, our sins shouldn't impact how people perceive God. And I agree with that. But the truth is, what we do or don't do impacts how people perceive God. How we live our lives, how we choose to do things, the honor that we, gain from how we behave, or the honor we don't gain based on how we behave, impacts how people perceive God. And so the good deeds we do directly impact how others perceive God. So the good that Joseph did led a nation to venerate his father. Once again, Jacob didn't do anything for these people, okay? He wasn't this Egyptian guy who helped. No, he was an Israelite. Joseph was the person who was adopted into Egyptian society, who took over the country, who led everything. His honor extended to his father. So the good Joseph did led a nation to venerate his father. And the good we do as Christ followers can lead others to venerate our father. Okay? The good that we do can lead others to honor God. And so that's something we need to think about when we're wondering, why should I continue to do good? Or why should I try so hard in this situation? Yes, the honor extends to our spouses and our parents and our kids and our employers, and that's important. But the honor also extends to God when we behave in a way that brings honor to him. And so that's kind of the biggest thing I take from the very beginning of this passage is, whoa, Jacob gets a great funeral. He did nothing to deserve that. Joseph did all the good things, and it reflected on Jacob. And your good things reflect on your loved ones and God. But we need to get to the theological part, the part that I sometimes feel inadequate to talk about. And so fortunately, our church works really hard to prepare all of our pastors. We get a lot of great resources. And so I'm going to share with you some of those resources today to help us understand human free will and God's sovereignty. So the most complicated theological implication of this story happens in verse 20. In chapter 50, verse 20, it says, "As for you," this is Joseph talking to his brothers, "you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." I have so many questions about this. Okay, so first of all, did God make them do this evil that eventually worked out his plan? Did he force the brothers to throw their brother into slavery? Did God allow them? Okay, maybe he didn't make them, but he allowed the evil to happen. He allowed these bad things to happen to Joseph to bring about his plan. Or what would God have done if they didn't sell their brother into slavery? How would he have made this plan happen? How would he have put Joseph into a place to save an entire nation? Like, what would he do? Or why didn't God just stop the evil they were doing and fix the problem? Like, why didn't he intervene and stop Joseph being sold into slavery and use a different plan to figure out how to solve the problems in the future? Or even further, why didn't God just stop the famine? Okay, like if he can do anything, why did he need to take Joseph through this insane life to solve this problem for this country when he could have just not had a famine? Like, these are the questions that I have. And I don't think we'll ever get clear answers on this. I think people have talked about this for centuries. Why does evil exist? And does God allow? And all that thing. That's not what we're going to talk about today. The bottom line that we want you to understand is this. Humans have free will, and God doesn't force our actions. God has free will, and our actions can't mess up what he has planned. Those are two big things. Humans have free will, and God does not force our actions. God has free will, and our actions can't mess up what he has planned. Proverbs 19:21 says this, "As many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." I love this verse because it lets me rest in the fact that I can't mess up what God's doing. I may not know what's going on, I may not understand it, but it says, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." Like, it's what kind of is going to happen. No matter what we do, we can't mess that up. Tim Keller says it this way. This is a great explanation. He says it's tempting to think that it's 50-50. It's like, okay, well, maybe the history of the world is 50% God doing what he wants and 50% human free will making it happen. It'd be easy to think that way. And Tim Keller says, no, don't think that way. Somehow it is actually 100% God's purposeful direction filled with human beings who are 100% responsible for their behavior. So it's 100% God having a purpose, a plan, a direction, filled with human beings who are 100% free to do what they want. And that's something that kind of causes our brains to explode. It's hard to understand, but it's both. It's God is sovereign, and we have free will. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says, both John and Judas were used by God to carry out his plans. Okay? Getting Jesus to the cross, the redemption of the world, all of that thing hinged on a few different guys doing a few different things. John got to do all the good stuff, and he continued to do good stuff after Jesus died and rose again. And then Judas was the guy who got to do all the bad stuff. He was the one who chose to do the evil that led to the plan. And so you get to choose. You get to choose if you're going to be John or Judas. God's plan is going to happen no matter what, but you get to choose the role that you take in his plan for your life, for the people in your life, for your church, for your community. You choose that. Choose to be Judas or choose to be John. I'm working to choose to be John. It's not always easy. We all have a sin nature we're battling against, but we get to choose. And this should bring you some relief. Yes, our decisions matter. They're part of God's plan. But when those brothers decided to sell their brother into slavery, nothing they did could mess up what God was going to do through Joseph's life. And so God used that free will moment, that moment of evil, these guys selling their brother into slavery, he used that to work a bigger plan. And those guys chose to be the bad guys. They chose to be the bad guys in God's plan, and God used it. We need to choose to be the good guys. Choose to do the good and be part of God's plan in that way. But this gives me peace of mind. When I'm seeking to make a decision, when things seem crazy in this world, I know that I can't mess up what God is doing. Yes, my decisions impact my family, and they impact that honor we were talking about earlier. When I choose to do good or choose to do bad, those decisions ultimately matter, but in the big scheme of things, I can't mess up what God's doing. So when I'm struggling through a life decision, when I'm trying to figure out the direction God wants me to go, I always land on the fact that no matter what I do, God's going to do what he wants, and I just got to trust him with that. And if you look at life that way, I think it's going to alleviate some of the stress and anxiety we face when we're looking at decisions, when we're looking at our life, when we're looking for God's will. You can't mess it up, okay? Yes, your decisions impact how you experience life and how your family experiences life, but you can't mess up God's plan. And I love that about this story. What they meant for evil, God meant for good. Because evil can be used by God. Like, this is probably the deepest, most in-depth question from this whole story is how did God use evil, but God is not evil, and God is opposed to evil, and God can't be in the presence of evil. All these things we know about him. He does not embrace evil, but he was able to use it. These are big questions. Why does evil exist? Why did God create a world where evil is possible? Why doesn't he eliminate all evil? Once again, big questions that men and women smarter than me have wrestled with for thousands of years. And I'm not here to help us figure that out. You can ask God about that when you get to heaven. But how can we be at peace when we face evil? That's what we can take from this story. We may not understand why evil exists. We may not understand why God's using it this way, but how can we be at peace when we face evil? Listen, Joseph faced a lot of evil and suffering in his life. Over the past 5 weeks, we've talked about the ups and downs. It's unclear if he always had a great attitude about it. We don't know, how he experienced evil in those situations. We have a story that goes about as deep as it possibly can, but we don't know how he faced the evil, how he felt about it while he was facing it. What can we do, though, when we experience evil and suffering firsthand like Joseph did for much of his life? And the answer to that is look to the cross. Listen, a pastor said this to me one time, and it's how I handle every bad situation. Whenever there's chaos in the world or, evil, suffering, disasters, wars, all these things, I look at the cross. Because here's the deal. Imagine Jesus on the cross. And imagine his mother at the foot of the cross watching her son die. I can't even watch movies where kids get hurt anymore because I think of my son or my daughter being hurt. I empathize, I can't handle it. So I can't fathom being at the foot of the cross watching the son that I love just being murdered, just dying slowly. So imagine Jesus' mom watching him, and she's thinking, God, what are you doing? Where are you? What happened to the plan? Are you even here? Think of all these questions that Mary was facing. And in the middle of her suffering, she had no clue that God was going to do what he was going to do. Yes, Jesus prophesied about his return and all these things, but ultimately everybody thought it was over. Everybody was like, this doesn't feel like a win. This doesn't feel like a victory. And in the middle of Mary's suffering, she had no clue that God was working out the redemption of the world through what she was watching. All she could see was, wow, this is a terrible situation and I hate it. She could not see the bigger picture. And as you watch evil unfold in your life and the lives of others, I'm encouraging you to think about the cross, because Mary, a few days later, was like, whoa, I get it. I see what God was doing. I see what he was working in this evil situation. And so when you face evil or see evil, ask the question, what good might God be working towards? What might he be doing? What catastrophe might God be using for an eternal purpose? What amount of suffering in your life might he be using to do something even greater that you can't imagine? We don't know. And the assurance is on the cross, watching that moment, remembering There was Mary, there was men and women, there was a population of disciples that were watching the Savior of the world die, and in that moment, it was the darkest moment they could imagine, and they could not see the good that was going to come because they couldn't see the future. We can take comfort in that story, the story of the cross, the story of Joseph, and honestly, the hundreds of other stories in the Bible with pain and suffering. They can assure us that any evil we see and experience is being used to achieve God's purposes in our lives and our world. Okay? Any evil we see can and is being used by God to do what he wants to do in a greater purpose. And once again, if you start doubting that, just think about the cross and think about those men and women watching their Savior die and then wondering what is going wrong. Like, God came in, he saved the day, he used evil to make ultimate eternal good for anybody who puts their faith in Jesus. Now, I wouldn't use this line of thinking to comfort someone who is losing loved ones in a war or those who are battling cancer. Like, saying, like, God's working good out of this, like, that's not what you need to say in that moment, okay? Sometimes they just need a hug, and they need you to cry with them and weep and mourn with them like the Scripture tells us to do. Often this line of thinking isn't super helpful to people who are in the depths of suffering. This idea that, well, God's working good in this. Like, I'm not sure if Joseph was sitting in prison for years thinking, well, God's working good, I can't wait to see what he does. Like, I'm sure he was in, like, the deepest, darkest moments of his life. But this line of thinking might help you, okay? It may not be something you can preach to someone who's suffering, but when you're facing a hard time, when you're facing difficulty, this line of thinking might get you through that tough season of work. It might get you through just the grind of doing something you don't feel like doing at work that you know you need to do, knowing that God might be using this grind to work out something good in your life later. Or this line of thinking might keep you a little calmer as you suffer through the 5th straight week of 1 a.m. feedings with a newborn. Like, knowing that God might be using this difficult moment to do something greater in your life and the life of your kids. Like, thinking and remembering, like, okay, God might be using this. You know, this line of thinking might provide the comfort you need as you watch your kids face bullying at school. You know, once again, I wouldn't tell them, like, hey, this bullying is probably working for God's good in your life. Like, that doesn't feel good. But in your heart, you can say, man, I hate watching my child suffer this way, but God's doing something. I'm going to trust him with that. I'm going to comfort, I'm going to love my kids through it, and I'm going to trust that God's doing something with this evil that I'm seeing in my kid's life at school. You know, this line of thinking might get you through another day of managing the chaos of dealing with aging parents. Once again, it's a tough life. There are suffering, difficult things happening. But if you remind yourself that God is working every difficult, suffering, evil moment to do something bigger, it's going to help, okay? You know, think about Joseph and how terrible his life was at moments and how God used him. But think about the cross and how terrible that moment was and how God used that event to save the world. And finally, you know, this line of thinking might help calm the anxiety as you face the chaos unfolding in our world. We are seeing multiple wars happening and things that we have no control over. And this idea that God might be doing something and is doing something bigger than we can imagine through all this stuff, through evil. He is using evil to do good, incredible things, not because he loves evil or he is evil, but because free will exists. Remembering that can help you face your personal chaos and the chaos that we see in the world. Trusting that God is using evil for good can be the safety blanket we need to face whatever struggles we encounter in this life. And so grab onto it, okay? Like a safety blanket, like something you grew up with, your little blanket. Like, it will comfort you if you remind yourself that God is using evil for good. He doesn't like evil. He doesn't embrace evil. He doesn't celebrate evil. But he is all-powerful, and he is using that in a bigger way that we can't fathom. So I want you to do something. When I was a student pastor for 10 years, I always ended every lesson saying, this is what you can do. Like, yeah, reading the Bible is great. Learning about the Bible is awesome. Like, digging into all these, Hebrew, Greek, that's awesome. But what are we going to do? What are we going to do with this? First of all, make choices that bring honor to God and those you love most. Okay, going back to the beginning of this chapter where Jacob died and an entire nation was like weeping for him because Joseph was so great. That's what we should be seeking in our lives, is to make such good choices, to be such good representations of our family and our employers and our God that people extend honor beyond just to us, but to those we love most, and especially God. Don't forget that anything you do or don't do reflects on your spouse, your kids, your parents, and your God. So if you're struggling with that motivation to do the right thing, remind yourself that when you do the right thing, your wife looks good, your husband looks good, your kids look good, and your God looks good when you make the right choices. Next, stop believing that what you do or don't do can damage God's plans. Yes, your decisions matter, and they impact how you experience life. They impact how your family experiences life. Like I said, the choices you make impact those around you. But nothing you do or don't do will mess up what God is doing. Just trust that. Rest in that. When you're struggling with a decision, when you're freaking out about a situation you can't control, trust that whatever you do or don't do can impact God's ultimate good. Yes, think clearly, think carefully, make good choices, get wise counsel, do the right thing, do the godly thing, but just trust that you're not going to mess up what God's doing. And finally, look to the cross when you see seemingly pointless evil and suffering in the world. Listen, if God can work good through the evil on the cross that we saw, through the death, the murder of a perfect, sinless human, fully God, fully human. If God can work good through that, the ultimate good, he is doing something with anything else we see, with any other suffering, any other pain, any other chaos. He is doing something with that. And so I want to encourage you to think about that. So that wraps up our story, our study of Joseph. We're so glad to be digging through this. Like I said, next week, we're going to be digging into our Christmas series. And just so you know, we've got a lot of Christmas opportunities happening. We would love for you to visit cityrise.org/Christmas, where you can learn about all the things happening. You can see our service times on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve is a Sunday this year, so it's a little bit different. Make sure you look that up. cityrise.org/Christmas for all of our activities in December, Christmas related, and then also our service times on Christmas Eve. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope to see you at one of our campuses soon.